Imagine this: you're dressed in layers of petticoats, corsets, and a giant hoop skirt the size of a small tent. You're attending a royal ball, sipping tea with nobles, and suddenly nature calls. Now what? How do you lift all that fabric? Where do you even go? And more importantly, how on earth did women menstruate in those dresses? Welcome to the Victorian era, an age of elegance, strict decorum, and downright baffling hygiene challenges. For decades, Victorian women were trussed up in crinolines and voluminous dresses. Queen Victoria herself was a fashion icon of this style. These puffy garments symbolized ideals of femininity, grace, and decorum. But beneath the grandeur lay a daily struggle most history books don't mention. In the early Victorian era, flushing, toilets and underground sewers were nothing but a fantasy. Europeans hadn't yet embraced the very concept of the toilet. And when nature called, well, you answered wherever you were. The old saying, when you got to go, you got to go. That was just a fact of life. With no indoor plumbing, people relieved themselves wherever they could, behind trees, in open fields, or right inside their homes. Yes, you heard that right, inside. Ever heard someone say they didn't have a pot to piss in? That wasn't just a colourful insult, it was a brutal reality. The pot referred to a chamber pot, a simple bowl used for collecting urine and feces. If you didn't own one, your only option was to step outside and hope for privacy. And the streets, they reeked. Victorians tossed the contents of these pots straight out the window, right onto the cobblestones below. High-heeled shoes and umbrellas weren't just fashion statements. They were survival gear in a city where the sky could rain waste. The chamber pot, often called a jerry in British slang, was a household staple. It came with a lid, and once it was used, the lid was sealed tightly. That lid wasn't for courtesy. It was a warning: this pot is full, approach at your own risk. In the grand homes of the Victorian elite, nobles and royals, you'd never see a chamber pot. But don't be fooled, they were everywhere, hidden, in ornate cabinets, tucked inside decorative furniture, or discreetly built into chairs. Servants scurried through the halls checking and emptying them multiple times a day, because even wealth couldn't escape the call of nature. If you had money, your bathroom might be a private wooden bench with a chamber pot tucked inside. But no matter how elegant the home, one question lingered: where did all that waste go? Enter the garderobe, a medieval-style toilet built on the upper floors of buildings, often hanging precariously over streets or alleyways. When it was time to empty the pot, the answer was simple: open the window and toss. To avoid drenching unfortunate passers-by, a shout would ring out, "Gardes l'eau," French for watch out for the water, a polite warning that something very impolite was about to fall from above, the stench unbearable. Homes reeked, streets overflowed, and entire cities drowned in their own filth. Some streets had raised stone steps, so pedestrians could leap over the running waste. But here's the real kicker. During the Napoleonic and English Civil Wars, government agents went door to door collecting chamber pot contents. Why? Because urine, yes, urine, was refined into saltpeter, a crucial ingredient in making gunpowder. Your pee was quite literally fueling war. And the women of the era, draped in layers of crinolines, petticoats, overskirts, and bodices, so many layers that undergarments, like knickers, weren't even necessary. With all that fabric swishing and swaying, no one noticed what wasn't underneath. Yes, you heard that right. For much of the Victorian era, ladies walked around without knickers. It wasn't until late in the period, when those massive bell-shaped crinolines began catching gusts of wind and flipping women over in public, that modesty demanded a new solution. Only then did society whisper, perhaps it's time for drawers. But these weren't what you're thinking. Early Victorian underwear, crotchless, to pant legs connected only at the waist with a split down the middle where it mattered most. Overlapping flaps of cotton offered just enough coverage until you squatted and they parted like curtains on a stage. Why? Because ladies weren't about to lift 20 pounds of petticoats, shifts, and skirts every time nature called. These open crotch drawers allowed a woman to simply lower herself over a chamber pot gracefully and discreetly, without bearing all to the world, or at least not to everyone. So how did it work? Chamber pots for women were specially designed, not round like the standard ones used by men, but oval, with scooped insides to fit snugly between the thighs. A lady would position the pot beneath her skirts. No squatting necessary, just a subtle maneuver under the fabric. Done right, no one in the room would even notice. At fancy balls or social gatherings, there were entire retiring rooms set aside just for this. Inside, multiple pots sat ready. A maid stood by like battlefield nurses. One would lift the many layers of the lady's gown, while another positioned the pot underneath her. Afterward, a quick wipe with a damp cloth, and she was back to the ballroom as if nothing had happened. Not all women had that luxury. For many, the process was simpler and rougher. Pot on the floor, skirts up, squat, clean up with whatever was on hand, old newspapers, leaves, corn cobs. But don't worry, we'll dive into those charming details a bit later. At the very base of a woman's wardrobe was the linen shift, soft, washable, and changed often, sometimes daily, sometimes with every new outfit. Maids and servants, though, wore far fewer layers and lived without the luxury of elaborate gowns or private retiring rooms. Privacy in the Victorian world, it was a luxury few even thought to expect, especially when it came to using the toilet. Modesty didn't apply when nature called. In poorer homes, entire families would relieve themselves in front of one another. There were no separate water closets, no locked doors, just the pot, the floor, or the yard. And at high society events, gentlemen would simply stroll into the garden and do their business among the roses. But let's get to the gritty part. The one question everyone wants to ask, but never dares. How did Victorians wipe their bottoms? Brace yourself. One of the most popular tools of the early Victorian era was the dried corn cob. Yes, corn on the cob, minus the kernels. It was rotated like a crude roller brush to, well, clean the area. And if that sounds primitive, remember, these weren't delicate instruments. They were reused, cleaned only occasionally, if at all. Another favorite, the sea sponge on a stick. After each use, it was dipped into a communal bucket filled with salt water or vinegar. Used again and again and again. And it wasn't just the Victorians. Early humans wiped with rocks, dirt, and clay, the very earth itself. Comfort wasn't the point. Cleanliness, that's debatable. It was about doing what had to be done. Other items that found their way to the rear: leaves, straw, and yes, seashells. You can probably imagine how well that went. As paper became more common and slightly more affordable, Victorians started turning to printed materials, newspapers, catalogues, even magazines. If you ever wondered what happened to last month's issue, it might have ended up in the chamber pot. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't begin to take shape until the late 1800s when patents began to appear. But it wasn't until the early 1900s that it was mass-produced into soft rolled sheets like we have today. Before that, let's just say a trip to the bathroom was not the refreshing experience we take for granted now. So how exactly did Victorian women manage menstruation in those mountains of fabric and steel-cage crinolines? Well, first it's important to know that Victorian women had fewer periods than women do today. Why? 3 main reasons. Puberty started around the same time as now, between 12 and 14, but menopause often came early, sometimes in a woman's mid-30s. On top of that, poor nutrition and relentless physical labor meant many women had low body fat, which often led to irregular cycles. But fewer periods didn't mean no periods. And when that time of the month came, Victorian women faced it without a single pad, tampon, or disposable product. They got resourceful. Women didn't wear tight-fitting underwear. Instead, their basic undergarment was a linen shift, a long, washable layer that protected expensive dresses from body oils and stains. But when bleeding began, they turned to something called the T-bandage. Picture a primitive bikini bottom tied at the waist and secured with a strip of cloth that ran between the legs. Inside, it was packed with absorbent rags. If the woman was to pull for cloth, she might use morse, sheep's wool, or layers of grass, whatever she could find that would soak up the blood. These rags were not thrown away. They were washed, dried, and used again and again, month after month. Women often had to change their T-bandage many as 12 to 20 times a day depending on their flow. It was exhausting, uncomfortable, and utterly necessary. On lighter days, some simply wore thicker petticoats, hoping the extra fabric would catch what needed catching. Later in the Victorian period, split-crotch drawers became common, but they offered almost no real protection. They were designed for ease of bathroom use, not for dealing with the mess of menstruation. And through it all, women were expected to remain graceful, poised, and utterly silent about what they were enduring: pain, blood, odor. It all had to be managed beneath layers of silk, lace, and iron discipline. No one talked about it, but every woman lived it. So how did Victorians wash those massive floor-sweeping dresses, the ones with trains, lace, ruffles, and yards of velvet? They didn't, at least not like we do today. Victorian laundry was an ordeal, a physically grueling, water-hauling, soap-scrubbing, back-breaking ritual. For many households, it was done only twice a year. During what was grimly called the Great Wash, imagine waiting 6 months to clean your clothing. That's not laziness, it's survival. You see, Victorian dresses weren't dropped into a washing tub with a splash of detergent. Full washings were rare and risky. Water and soap could ruin fine fabrics. So instead, women cleaned their dresses by sprinkling them with talcum powder, brushing off the dust, and along with it, the odor of sweat and skin. It didn't remove the smell, it just covered it. If a dress wasn't being worn, it was carefully folded and stored in cedar-lined trunks or closets designed to keep out moths and insects. These were treasures, not just clothing, but works of craftsmanship, sewn with astonishing skill, detail, and the finest materials available. And yet, these garments were worn until they were threadbare, or until the stench was so overpowering it practically screamed before you even entered the room. But beneath those elaborate gowns, hidden from view, was the real shield against filth. Layers upon layers of washable undergarments, shifts, chemises, petticoats, crinolines. These absorbed the sweat and protected the valuable outerwear, and those could be scrubbed by hand in boiling water with harsh soap, often by overworked maids or laundresses. Victorian beauty came at a cost, and that cost was sweat, time, and smell. So now here's the real question. If you had the chance, would you turn back the clock and live like this? Layered in silk and soot, walking through sewage, brushing, powder over body odor, and managing periods with morse and rags? Let us know in the comments below.